Colonel Ivan Morozov trusts the green line on his radar screen the way a priest trusts scripture. It is May 17, 1967, and deep within a concrete bunker on the Kola Peninsula, the Soviet Air Defense Forces have built a fortress of mathematics and steel. That fortress and the faith of the men inside it is about to be shattered by a single, impossible point of light. The date is the 17th of May, a cold Wednesday morning. The place is a concrete bunker, buried deep beneath the frozen Arctic tundra of the Kola Peninsula. This is the nerve center for the 10th Independent Air Defense Army of the Soviet Union, a refrigerated cathedral dedicated to the science of vigilance. The air is cool and smells of vacuum tubes, stale tobacco, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone from the humming machinery. The only sounds are the quiet clicks of relays, the low hum of ventilation, and the clipped, hushed voices of men who have learned to speak in the precise language of coordinates and vectors. Colonel Ivan Morozov sits before a wall of curved glass consoles, his world framed by the slow, patient sweep of the green line on his main display. To him, the radar's rhythmic pulse is a heartbeat, slow, regular, and deeply reassuring. It is the sound of order, of control. Around him, in the dim, green-tinged light, other men move small wooden blocks across a massive, illuminated mapboard that dominates the far wall. Each block represents a fighter squadron, a missile battery, a link in the vast and intricate geometry of defense. This is the PVO, the Protivovosdushnaya Oborona, the shield of the nation. It is a fortress built not just of concrete, but of math and steel. Its doctrine, forged in the fires of the Great Patriotic War, is absolute. Nothing gets through. The memory of 1941, of cities shattered by German bombers falling from an undefended sky, is a foundational trauma that has been recoded into the very DNA of the Soviet state. The sky is a sanctified realm, and the men of the PVO are its priests, its guardians. On this cold Wednesday morning, that doctrine, that faith, will be challenged by a thing that no doctrine had ever anticipated. A junior lieutenant's voice, filtered through the crackle of the internal circuit, breaks the quiet. "Comrade Colonel, we have a contact. Sector 4, bearing 090. Morozov's heavy wooden chair creaks as he leans forward, his eyes fixed on the main screen. A single, impossibly small dot has appeared, scraping its way across the sea from the east. For a long, considered moment, he thinks of all the rational, mundane explanations. It could be a calibration error. Machinery, even the robust, over-engineered machinery of the Soviet military, sometimes failed. Vacuum tubes could misread numbers. Atmospheric conditions could create phantom returns. But the dot keeps moving, and its movement is all wrong. It is not the slow, deliberate crawl of a heavy bomber. It is not the abrupt, fleeting dash of a reconnaissance jet. This object is moving with the velocity of a ballistic missile, yet it maintains the steady, level attitude of an atmospheric craft. The plotting board, fed by the raw data from the radar, begins to flash numbers that read like a riddle. The altitude is 80,000 feet. The speed is beyond what the system was even designed to accurately register. The low hum of the room seems to fall away. The men stop their movements. The greenish glow from the consoles paints their faces in the same ethereal color as the map. They stare at the numbers on the board as if the information were a physical thing, an intruder that had just materialized in the center of their sanctuary. The core belief that has kept the PVO confident for decades, the belief that their sky could not be violated, stiffens in their throats, and then, in an instant, it breaks. "Check your calibration, Lieutenant," Morozov says, his voice a low and steady command. He keeps it calm because the uniform, the rank, and the men watching him all require calm. It must be noise. "All stations report it, Comrade Colonel," the lieutenant answers, his own voice tight but professional. From Severomorsk to the entire coastal chain, it is the same signature. The confirmation sends a cold, sharp current through the room. This is not a glitch. This is real. Morozov grabs the heavy black handset of the direct line and makes a terse call to the nearby interceptor wing. "Victor, scramble everything you have. 2 flights, Vector 090. There is a brief, almost imperceptible pause on the other end of the line. The wing commander's voice comes back, trembling just slightly around the edges with disbelief. "Comrade Colonel, an Angel at 80 plus, 80,000 feet, is that a correct reading?" The term angel is pilot slang for altitude in thousands of feet. "Yes," Morozov says, his voice now hard as ice. "Scramble." The attempt to climb the interceptors to this impossible altitude becomes a desperate, textbook-free improvisation. On the ground, crews shove their machines to unnatural attitudes, watching the altimeters on their own screens tizzy towards a ceiling that is sprained with system warnings. In the cockpits, instruments bleed numbers that the pilots have only ever seen in training simulations. Men in heavy pressure suits hunch forward, clutching at yokes that cannot do the impossible. They are chasing a ghost, a phantom that lives in a thinner, purer, and colder sky than they have ever known. For the men in Morozov's bunker, the psychological reverberation of this moment is far worse than any immediate physical threat. The PVO had been forged from the memory of vulnerability, and it had built a culture of absolute, uncompromising defense and response. To see that defense, that sanctity, pierced so easily and so arrogantly is a profound affront to their very identity. They are guardians who have just discovered that their walls are made of paper. The dot on the screen is no longer just a contact. It is an indictment. It is a judgment delivered from the edge of space on their readiness, their technology, and their entire way of thinking. The fortress has been breached, and the priests are left staring at the altar, wondering what god they have offended. While Colonel Morozov and his men grapple with the phantom on their screens, a very different kind of story is unfolding in the thin, cold air high above the Barents Sea. The Soviet interceptor pilots, the human tip of the PVO's spear, are engaged in a desperate and ultimately futile vertical chase. From the cockpit of his Sukhoi Su-15, the intruder is nothing more than a distant silver glint against a dark purple sky. Against that glint, all of his training, his courage, and his powerful machine feel like obsolete relics from a bygone era. The dot on the radar screen continues its serene, unhurried path, crossing over the heavily fortified naval base of Severomorsk, the headquarters of the Soviet Northern Fleet. It lingers for a time, a silent, omniscient eye hanging over the submarine pens, the dry docks, and the carefully arranged geometry of military installations that no foreign camera has ever seen with such a precise and unobstructed view. For 25 minutes, the Blackbird remains inside Soviet-controlled airspace. In that time, it does more than just gather intelligence. It demonstrates a gap, a chasm, not just in technological capability, but in imagination. When the dot finally vanishes, as quickly and as silently as it had arrived, sweeping out over the Norwegian Sea after a graceful, impossibly fast turn over Finland, the tension in the bunker does not dissipate. It solidifies into a cold, hard panic. The entire PVO system goes to full alert. Missile batteries are brought to launch readiness. A heavy sense of declension, of a world that has been fundamentally reordered, hangs in the bunker's recycled air. They had thrown everything they had, their best radars, their fastest interceptors, at a single, unidentified machine, and they had failed to even touch it. These early missions of the SR-71 Blackbird were not bizarre anomalies. They were the calculated opening gambit of a sustained and systematic intelligence program, one that would steadily train its powerful cameras on the Soviet Union in a way that no single bombing campaign had ever managed. From its main operating base in California and later from a network of secretive sites and allied airfields around the world, the Blackbird began to fly routes that were immaculately planned to cut across the most sensitive and strategically vital areas of the Warsaw Pact. One of these mission profiles, known informally among some Western crews as the Baltic Express, was a particularly audacious demonstration of this new capability. The Blackbird would scream across the North Sea at over 2,000 miles per hour, bank sharply over Denmark, and then run a perfectly straight line down the Baltic coast, its cameras and sensors mapping the shipyards of Poland, the airfields of East Germany, and the dense radar arrays of the Soviet Baltic republics in exquisite, granular detail. Each of these overflights was more than just an intelligence-gathering mission. It was a political statement, a recurring demonstration of an unsettling truth. We can come where we please, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. Across the globe, the instruments of American power were telling another story, one not of panic, but of purpose. In the hangars of Palmdale, California, and on the remote, sun-baked air bases of the American desert, the Blackbird was understood not as a ghost, but as the result of a distinctly American kind of madness, a relentless insistence on making technology answer a difficult political problem. The shoot-down of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union in 1960 had been a profound shock and a deep political embarrassment for the United States. The U-2 had been high, but it was also slow, and it had proven to be vulnerable. The new requirement that emerged from that crisis was for a spy platform so fast and so high as to be, for all practical purposes, invulnerable. It had to be an airplane that could slip past every defensive net that the world's military architects had laid out. It needed to be faster than any fighter that could be sent to intercept it, higher than the engagement envelope of most surface-to-air missiles, and clever enough in its design to make the simple act of being seen on a radar screen the only victory an enemy could hope to claim. The challenge was immense, but Lockheed's legendary Advanced Development Projects Division, the Skunk Works, under the demanding leadership of Kelly Johnson, provided the answer. The SR-71 Blackbird was not merely an aircraft, it was a compendium of revolutionary engineering compromises and stunning breakthroughs. It was built from a skin of exotic titanium alloy that would glow red hot and physically expand in flight. Its unique J-58 engines were a hybrid design that behaved like conventional turbojets at lower speeds and then transformed themselves into highly efficient ramjets at altitude. It burned a special, non-volatile fuel that had to be chemically ignited, a fuel that also served as a coolant for the entire system. And it was equipped with cameras and sensors of such power and resolution that their film and electronic intelligence would eventually make entire Soviet submarine fleets and naval yards perfectly legible to the analysts back in Washington. The unseen ghost that haunted Colonel Morozov's bunker was, in reality, a meticulously designed and brutally effective tool of modern statecraft. The story of that first impossible overflight is not just a story of machines and doctrines, it is the story of the men who were caught within their unforgiving logic. In that single 25-minute encounter, the lives and the professional identities of three men separated by thousands of miles and a seemingly impassable ideological wall became briefly, inextricably, and invisibly intertwined. Their individual experiences, braided together, formed the true fabric of a strategic contest that would outlast all of their careers. In the concrete bunker deep beneath the Arctic tundra, Colonel Ivan Morozov's hands were perfectly still when the contact finally cleared his screen. In the flash of the aftermath, in the quiet hum of the room, his hair smelled faintly of ozone and the stale tobacco of a dozen cigarettes. For a long time he did not speak. He simply watched the empty screen, the familiar green line now seeming to mock him with its placid, sweeping motion. The bunker hummed with the aftershocks of the event, the frantic clicks of tape reels recording every scrap of data, the quiet, urgent whispers of men on secure radio lines. He had been trained his entire life to believe in a woven shield, a defense in depth whose strands were missiles, fighters, and radar operators like himself. The Blackbird had come, it had seen, and it had returned, and that shield had proven to be as fragile as a spider's web. A political officer, a man whose presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of the stakes, stood beside him, his face a mask of cold fury. "Report immediately to the Central Committee's liaison," he said, his voice like ice. "You will be required to account for this failure." For Morozov, the professional offense, "How dare someone show up in our sky and take pictures?" was rapidly being eclipsed by a cold personal fear. 200 kilometers away, at a windswept interceptor base, Captain Yuri Petrov wrestled with the bitter aftertaste of his own failure. Petrov was a pilot's pilot, a product of a Soviet academy where collectivist ideals and heroic, martial poses framed a life of dedicated service. He had been told that the skies were a hammer, a tool for projecting the state's power. He had been given a sharpened, powerful hammer in the form of his Sukhoi Su-15, and he had been taught to use it with skill and aggression. That morning's flight had been a profound assault on his professional soul. He had climbed to altitudes that felt like they were stealing the very blood from his ears, a place where the sun was a malevolent, burning eye in a black sky. He had pushed his machine to its breaking point, and it had roared back at him with nothing but blankness and futility. He had chased a ghost, and the ghost had won without even acknowledging his presence. In the quiet of the ready room, he knew better than to voice his demoralization. The political cadres punished the airing of such weakness. But he could not stop. The thought from circling in his mind, when the next new thing comes, what then? His faith in the hammer had been shaken. And high above them both, in the sleek, black vehicle of American dominance, Lieutenant Commander Alan Cross sat in his cockpit and felt a very different cocktail of emotions. Cross had trained for this mission for months in complex jigs and high-fidelity simulators until his mind had folded the plane's incredible demands into pure muscle memory. For him, the flight of the Blackbird was the completion of a peculiar and demanding kind of art form. It was a jigsaw puzzle of precise navigation, a delicate compromise between the need for speed and the focus required for the sensors to do their work. It was the methodical scanning of an entire nation's secrets, recorded on a strip of film the size of a trader's ledger. He flew like a man in the vaulted ceiling of a great cathedral, far above the sermon on the ground, and well away from the heat of the argument. There was pride in his heart, yes, a quiet satisfaction in the flawless execution of a difficult task. But there was also a strange, almost clinical distance from the world below. This was a job in which the physical consequences were measured not in the immediate taste of victory or defeat, traded eye to eye in the chaos of a dogfight, but in the cool, abstract language of photographs and intelligence briefings that would be delivered weeks later in quiet, windowless rooms. These three men, the Guardian, the Warrior, and the Observer, could not possibly see the same truth in the events of that day. Morozov saw a sacred space violated. Petrov saw his skills and courage rendered meaningless. Cross saw a complex technical problem being elegantly solved. Yet their three stories, their three profoundly different experiences of the same 25 minutes, were the threads that would be woven into the larger fabric of the Cold War. Each mission of the Blackbird would leave scars, not on the bodies of men, but on the systems they inhabited, on their doctrines, on their budgets, and most importantly, on their faith in the things they had once believed to be absolute. In the wake of the first Blackbird overflights, the Soviet response was predictably, and perhaps inevitably, Soviet. It was industrial, it was massive, and it was born from a deeply ingrained philosophy of force, where the Americans had aimed for a surgical and almost esoteric form of technological dominance. The Kremlin attempted to produce a brute force counterweight. If the American approach was a fencer's rapier, elegant, precise, and deadly, the Soviet response was to build a bigger, heavier, and more powerful hammer. The result of this effort, a machine born of equal parts desperation, pride, and engineering genius, was the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25, known to the West by its NATO reporting name, the Foxbat. The MiG-25 was an answer built on a philosophy of pure, unadulterated power. It was a colossal aircraft, heavy, rugged, and fast, designed from the ground up to do one thing better than any other aircraft on Earth: climb hard and fast and push its engines to the point of near destruction in mighty, short-lived bursts of speed. Where the American path to sustained high-speed flight had been to cleverly engineer a new kind of efficiency, the Soviet route was to design an interceptor that could, in theory, meet and even exceed the Blackbird's speed, if only for a few fleeting and glorious minutes. The designers of the Foxbat, borrowing from their own triumphs and errors, created a machine that was a perfect portrait of a system that believed quantity, raw power, and simplified, rugged mechanics were the ultimate solutions to the challenges of innovation. The MiG-25 was a marvel of this brute force approach. It could reach incredible speeds for short durations, but the practicalities of its design and the limitations of Soviet metallurgy once again undermined the theory. Its massive Tumansky R-15 engines, originally designed for a high-altitude cruise missile, were not made for the sustained high-temperature environment of a Mach 3 flight. Pushing them to their limits, as Yuri Petrov and other pilots would discover, was a surefire way to destroy them. Its radar and missile systems were similarly blunt instruments. The Foxbat was equipped with a massive and incredibly powerful radar, the Smerche, which was necessary to burn through the electronic countermeasures of its intended targets, high-flying American bombers. But against a small, stealthy, and incredibly fast target like the SR-71, it was like trying to hit a fly with a sledgehammer. The radar's pulses were powerful, but not precise enough, and the large, heavy R-40 air-to-air missiles it carried were not agile enough to maneuver for a kill at such extreme altitudes and closing speeds. More importantly, the MiG-25 was produced in a strategic culture that consistently emphasized deployable, rugged power over the kind of delicate, sustained innovation that the Blackbird represented. The United States, by contrast, had made decades-long, patient investments in the foundational technologies that made the SR-71 possible. In advanced materials like titanium, in exotic fuel chemistry, and in the miniaturized solid-state avionics that could sustain a peak performance across an entire multi-hour mission profile. The Soviet Union, in a desperate race to catch up, had built a magnificent sprinter. The problem was that the Blackbird was a world-class marathon runner. The MiG-25 was an impressive answer, but it was an answer to the wrong question. It was a hammer designed to shatter a wall, when what was truly needed was a key to unlock a very complex and well-guarded door. The Foxbat was a testament to what the Soviet system could achieve when it focused its immense industrial might on a single problem. It was also ultimately a testament to the limits of that same system. While the engineers in the design bureaus and the pilots in their experimental aircraft were engaged in a high-stakes, high-altitude duel of technologies, a quieter but no less significant battle was being waged on the ground, in the minds of the men of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The psychological toll of the Blackbird's repeated, untouchable incursions was as important as any technical mismatch. Each overflight was a reminder of their own impotence, a small but powerful ritual of humiliation. The sound of the Blackbird became a part of the landscape of the Cold War, a sound associated with a unique and frustrating kind of helplessness. Because of its extreme altitude and speed, the SR-71 did not produce the single, crisp sonic boom of a low-altitude supersonic pass. Instead, it generated a slow, rolling series of thuds, a deep and distant cello note that would roll across an entire military installation, rattling windows and vibrating through the concrete of the bunkers. For the soldiers and sailors who had been trained their entire lives to be the guardians of their nation's sanctity, this sound became a recurring indictment, a physical manifestation of their own failure. They were guardians who could not guard, gatekeepers who could not keep the gate. The official state propaganda, of course, could braid over these uncomfortable facts. The newspapers and the state-controlled television would continue to shout about the glorious achievements of Soviet science and the invincibility of the Red Army. But the men who lived through the sorties, the men who sat in the radar bunkers and manned the missile batteries, they lived a different truth. Their defenses, which on paper were the most formidable in the world, could be bypassed with a level of complacent and mocking technical superiority that undercut all of the official claims of parity. This created a slow, corrosive doubt that spread through the ranks. In the mess halls and the barrack rooms, after the official briefings were over, the conversations would turn. Men would trade stories in hushed and conspiratorial tones about the strange rumble from the stratosphere and the way the ground would seem to vibrate for a few seconds afterward. Children living on the closed military bases would press their faces to the kitchen windows and watch the sky for an impossible contrail that was never there. In these small private ways, public faith, or at least the faith of those on the front lines, began to waver. Propaganda could maintain the illusion of strength for the general population, but a household's private knowledge can be a stubborn and powerful thing. It remembers the sons who come back from their pilot training frustrated and demoralized. It remembers the soldiers who speak in nervous, conspiratorial laughter about the things they are not supposed to say aloud. Over time, these private fissures in the official narrative can connect, creating a deep and underlying sense of unease. The Blackbird's missions became more than just a military and intelligence problem. They became a cultural one. They punctured a larger, existential logic that was central to the identity of the Soviet state. For decades, the Soviet government had told itself, its citizens, and the world a powerful story of its own technological capability. The story was that socialist planning, by marshaling the vast resources of the state and training its loyal cadres, could not only match, but ultimately outproduce its capitalist rivals. The Blackbird forced an uncomfortable and undeniable comparison. It was a product of a very different system, a system of small, empowered, and secretive teams that were allowed to iterate, to experiment, and to fail quickly and quietly. It was a system that valued and rewarded the improbable. The Skunk Works could rapidly prototype new ideas, pivot when they didn't work, and quietly procure the exotic materials they needed through the complex and often shadowy folds of the global market. The rigid, centralized, and risk-averse Soviet bureaucracy, for all its immense power, could not perform the same kind of nimble, creative alchemy, even when the stakes were existential. The result was a recurring humiliation that went to the very heart of the Soviet project. Each silent overflight was a testament to the fact that their system, in this one critical area, had been outpaced, outthought, and outmaneuvered. The ghost in the sky was not just a plane, it was the embodiment of a different and more effective way of turning ideas into reality. The long, frustrating, and ultimately futile chase after the Blackbird revealed a problem that ran much deeper than a simple technological gap. The failure of the Soviet system to produce an effective counter to the SR-71 was not just a failure of metallurgy or engine design, it was a failure of imagination. It was a crisis rooted in the very culture of the Soviet state, a system that, for all its immense power, was fundamentally ill-equipped to compete in this new, high-stakes game of iterative and disruptive innovation. The stark contrast between the two engineering philosophies could not have been more clear. The Skunk Works, under Kelly Johnson, operated as a semi-autonomous island of creativity within the larger American military-industrial complex. It was a place where small, hand-picked teams were given immense resources, a clear and ambitious goal, and then, most importantly, the freedom to fail. They were encouraged to take risks, to try unconventional ideas, and to challenge the established orthodoxies of their own field. The Blackbird itself was a product of this culture, a machine built of 1,000 small, improbable breakthroughs, from its hybrid engines to its expanding, fuel-sealing skin. The Soviet system, on the other hand, was built to resist precisely this kind of deviation. It was a vast, centralized, and deeply conservative bureaucracy designed to produce predictable and reliable results on a massive scale. It could build thousands of rugged, effective tanks. It could pour concrete and lay down railway lines with an astonishing speed. But it could not, as a rule, tolerate the kind of agile, risk-taking, and often chaotic process that leads to true, game-changing innovation. The Soviet procurement system was notoriously slow and resistant to rewarding risk. A design bureau that proposed a radical, untested idea was more likely to be punished for its deviation from the established plan than it was to be rewarded for its creativity. The economy, centrally planned and managed, could not pivot gracefully to accommodate the sudden need for exotic materials or new, specialized manufacturing processes. And the intelligence apparatus, while vast and powerful, was often too rigid and too compartmentalized to extract and act upon raw technical data with the speed and agility that this new kind of competition demanded. The Blackbird, in effect, exposed a nested and interconnected set of these systemic deficits. It was not just a faster plane, it was the product of a faster, more adaptable system. The humiliation of the overflights induced a series of costly and largely reactionary responses from the Kremlin. Funds that were desperately needed elsewhere were diverted into the air defense budget. New programs were launched in a frantic effort to close the gap. The MiG-25 was built and then refined into the even more advanced MiG-31, and 100 production lines rolled out respectable numbers of these heavy, powerful interceptors. But quantity in this case could not entirely paper over the deficit in quality and in underlying philosophy. The new MiGs still needed pilots who were willing to risk catastrophic engine failure to push their machines to the limit. They still needed maintenance crews who could perform miracles in the harsh conditions of the field. And the Soviet supply chain, still hampered by its material and process challenges, could not match the layered, systemic advantages that the Americans had painstakingly built into the single, revolutionary airframe of the Blackbird and its complex supporting systems. In a larger cultural sense, the black wing of the SR-71 scratched away at the core narratives of the Soviet state. For the men in the PVO bunkers, the recurring sorties were a constant personal indictment of their own effectiveness. For their superiors in Moscow, each perfectly clear photograph of a sensitive naval yard, each accurate readout of their missile deployments, was a piece of irrefutable political evidence that their nation was vulnerable. the public face of bravado and confidence slowly gave way behind closed doors to a gnawing paranoia. The Kremlin's answer to this paranoia was sometimes technical, investing in new, more powerful radars and better interceptor designs, and sometimes purely procedural, clamp down on dissent, clamp down on data leaks, and punish any admission of failure. But technological fixes can only ever be one component of a true strategic equilibrium. The Blackbird had exposed a weakness that could not be solved with more steel or a bigger engine. It had exposed a weakness in the very way the Soviet system thought about and responded to the future. It was, at its heart, a failure of imagination. The true, lasting legacy of the SR-71 Blackbird was not just the intelligence it gathered, but the new and unwelcome transparency it imposed upon the closed world of the Soviet Union. For decades, the Cold War had been a contest fought in the shadows, a game of bluffs and counterbluffs where both sides kept many of their true capabilities hidden. This mutual opacity, this shared doubt about the other's real strength, was a powerful argument for restraint. The Blackbird, with its all-seeing cameras, began to methodically evaporate that opacity. When the American spy plane returned from its missions with startlingly clear photographs of hardened submarine pens, of new missile fields under construction, and of the operational readiness of naval shipyards, some of that strategic ambiguity disappeared. The intelligence gleaned from these overflights mattered not just tactically but geopolitically. To know with a high degree of certainty an opponent's force disposition, their repair infrastructure, and their hidden industrial capacities was to make that opponent legible in peacetime. And a legible opponent is a more predictable and therefore less intimidating opponent. The Blackbird's operations, in effect, transplanted a constant, low-grade moment of asymmetry directly into the daily calculations of global strategy. It made the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities more than just a theoretical possibility. It made them a visible, undeniable, and recurring fact. This had a subtle but corrosive effect on the confidence of a system whose legitimacy rested, in large part, on its perceived technological and military prowess. The arc of the conflict began to change in smaller, softer ways as well. Within the Soviet military and engineering communities, the repeated embarrassments forced a series of difficult internal debates. Engineers began to argue for more flexible thinking, for a new approach to procurement that might reward risk, and for the need to decentralize experimental design to give small, agile teams more room to pursue risky breakthroughs in materials science and manufacturing. Many of these debates reached no definitive outcome. The immense institutional inertia of the Soviet system, the vested interests of the old guard, and a pervasive fear of political repercussions kept any real change slow and incremental. But the seeds of a new way of thinking had been planted. For the men living in the cold, concrete trenches of the air defense network, however, these long-term seeds of change were no consolation for their immediate and recurring humiliation. The ghost in the sky had done more than just collect photographs. It had forced the entire Soviet air defense apparatus to look inward and to see, with a brutal clarity, the limits of what their system could do. It had compelled them to chase, to attempt dramatic and costly repairs, to produce large and expensive interceptors, to completely rework their radar arrays, and to spend scarce national resources in a constant reactionary fever. The opportunity costs of this defensive obsession, the schools and hospitals that were not built, the civilian industries that were not modernized, were real and significant. In a symbolic moment decades later, in November of 1989, as the Berlin Wall was being hacked and chipped away by ordinary citizens, a former PVO officer stood in the joyous crowd near the Brandenburg Gate. He had spent his entire life in the small, cold rooms where men watched green lines sweep across cathode screens. Tucked away in his apartment were the dusty, classified after-action reports that described a series of technological humiliations the public would never know in full. As he watched the ordinary people of Berlin chiseling away at the concrete and steel, he saw a form of agency and power that his instruments had never been designed to measure. The lesson he took away from that moment was not that a single airplane had ended an empire. That would be a simplistic and misleading story. The lesson was that the many small, repeated embarrassments, technical, moral, and political, had slowly, relentlessly worn away at the edges of his own system's confidence. The Blackbird had become an emblem of that process, a recurring reminder that being outpaced in innovation touches more than just militaries. It touches the civic imagination. It raises quiet but persistent questions about the competence of a regime and the promises it has made to its people. The ghost in the sky, in the end, did not belong to one nation or one ideology. It belonged to a future that could no longer be monopolized by centralized top-down command. It belonged, paradoxically, to the thin seam of people, on both sides, who took chances on metallurgy, on chemistry, and on the pure, simple courage to fly faster, higher, and more precisely than anyone else thought was necessary. When Colonel Morozov finally left his bunker on that long and frustrating day back in 1967, he walked past the massive mapboard and ran his fingers over the small wooden blocks, a gesture of old routine and some forgotten superstition. The lines of longitude and latitude on the map looked the same. The inked names of the cities and the bases were unchanged, but the blocks themselves, the symbols of his power and his purpose, felt lighter in his hands. He could not explain why, except that the world above him, the sky he was sworn to protect, had just acquired an unwelcome and irreversible new transparency.